All right, I've got the recording started. It looks like a lot of people who registered are here, so we can go ahead and get started. Give me a second to pull everything up. Perfect. All right. So before we get into the actual webinar, I wanted to give a short breakdown. The current plan is for it to be about 30 to 45 minutes of information, and then roughly 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So if you've got any questions, definitely stick around to the end. Ask anything that's on your mind. I will try to answer them as best I can. I'm not able to give too much specific advice in this, but please, the Q&A is my favorite part, and I know a lot of other people get a lot out of it. So definitely stick around to ask some questions. Now, with the format of the webinar laid out, I wanted to give an introduction of who I am and what we're actually going to cover. I'm Chad Lively. I'm the owner and lead financial planner of Lively Financial, and this webinar is a part of a much larger series I've been doing lately, which again, thank you guys for that. I've really loved the attendance for it, the support. You guys have been fantastic. But I do these webinars, and the idea is to cover everything that goes into your financial health. The last webinar was on budgeting. After it, I got a lot of questions about debt, so I figured that would be the focal point of this presentation. The idea behind all of these webinars is that your financial health goes beyond just the numbers, goes beyond just your income and your expenses. I really want these presentations to be as actionable as they are informative, because it's so important that you understand the impact that your financial choices have on your life. Every decision you make and habit you develop is just one piece of that entire picture. So today we're going to specifically cover debt and credit scores. This means we're going to discuss the emotional aspect of debt, how credit scores affect your financial decisions, and why these topics are critical for your long-term financial success. We're also going to cover some ways that you can improve your financial situation if you're currently living with debt or currently have a low credit score. So like I said, the goal is for this to be as actionable as it is informative. Now, before we get into the information, for compliance, I have to give the disclaimer that all of this is based off of my experience in the financial industry, working with my clients, and that all the information here is for educational purposes only. Everyone's situation is different, and there's no one-size-fits-all advice when it comes to financial planning. So think about your specific situation before putting any of this advice into action. And when in doubt, get a third party. I would be happy to help anyone on this call, so don't hesitate to reach out with questions. Now we can finally get into things. All right, as I alluded to in the introduction, the first step to determining what you need to work on and work toward is getting to know your current financial situation. For this webinar, I recommend you start by gathering all the information you have regarding any lines of debt you currently have. This means getting to know how much you owe, what the interest rate is, what the timeline looks like to pay it off, and if you have any other limitations on that line of debt. Again, I want this to be as actionable as it is informative, and the first starting point is sort of getting all that information together so you can actually act upon it. So knowing this information is going to go a long way towards making the rest of this presentation, like I said, that much more actionable. Beyond just getting your debt-related paperwork in order, there is a lot more to this when it comes to your financial health that we're going to talk about. We're going to start discussing, debt pay down strategies. And a lot of that, like I said, is going to go back to you having this paperwork sort of on hand, or this knowledge on top of your head from this moment forward. So it's not just about your income and expenses. It's about the holistic picture, including your ability to save, your ability to invest, whether you have set yourself up to weather financial storms. Ultimately, even if we come up with a plan to tackle any debt you may have and improve your credit score today, which again is the big goal of this webinar, if you haven't set yourself up with good habits and spending patterns, you're very likely to fall right back into debt. I've seen people that filed for bankruptcy because they got themselves into a tight spot, and afterwards they go right back to that same tight spot. So again, you need to think critically about exactly how you've gotten every line of debt that you may have. When did you, for example, use your credit card? Why? And how can we set ourselves up to not have to do that again? The goal is that by the end of this, we have knowledge, we have some semblance of a plan to improve our financial health, and that we understand sort of some of these financial habits that we need to be working toward. So let's start with the basics of debt. It isn't as black and white as most people think, and it can get pretty complicated, especially when we start dealing with multiple lines of debt coming from different sources. There's good debt, or I've heard of call it better debt, is things like a mortgage, educational loans. These are things that, while they can still cause problems, I've seen people with student loans that really put pressure on their income. Even though these things cause problems, they're often an investment in your future. And the opposite end of this is sort of purely bad debt, which is usually has a much higher interest rate, shorter time frames, things like credit card debt. These debts will impede your financial progress. They don't have any sort of investment side of them. They're just purely consumer debt. Additionally, what determines the quality of your debt is what you have at stake. What I mean by this is that there are secured lines of credit where the debt is backed by collateral, and there's unsecured debt, which has no collateral. Understanding the repercussions of having collateral or not having collateral can also make your debt situation more complicated. So we're going to go a little bit more into detail on each of these, but I want to give sort of a basic purview before we get into it. So I talked about sort of better debt. As I mentioned, a common example of good debt that people will talk about is something like student loans. The idea behind them being that they are investments to increase your earning potential down the line. But like I was just saying, just because this type of debt is an investment and categorized as good debt does not mean that it can't cause hardships. The type of loan can even be more demanding when it comes to management, because discharging student loans in bankruptcy is an immensely challenging process and really just not doable for most people. So for lack of a better word, if you have student loans, you are pretty much stuck with them. There's no way to bankruptcy out of them for the most part. You're going to have to pay them off, or die trying, basically. So it can be a little bit more demanding in that aspect, even though it is, again, considered good debt because it's an investment. But because of this, there are some options on paying down student loans. Programs like income-driven repayment plans, or IDR plans, they offer a flexible plan by adjusting payments based on your income levels. Additionally, there's loan forgiveness initiatives, things like working in the realm of public service or specific career paths can assist in reducing remaining loan balances after fulfilling certain requirements. During times of financial hardship, like we saw with COVID, there are usually temporary solutions in the form of deferments or forbearance, which also lets borrowers put a pause on payments. The goal of those sorts of features are to provide temporary relief until you can return back to regular payments. But the key takeaway that I want you to get from this is that, even whenever people talk about good debt, you can make a strong argument that there's no such thing as good debt. Like there's better debt for sure. And this student loans, mortgages are some of them. But I just want you to understand that, it can still create hardships. And so you should know what you're getting into before you take them. If you already have student debts, look at your repayment options. They can have more flexibility in repayments than other loans, but they are typically impossible to get rid of in something like bankruptcy. So you are going to end up definitely having to pay off these payments pretty much no matter what, but look up things, like I said, an IDR plan. And I'm getting a lot of noise from the presentation. Let me take a look at it. I don't know if that's just people coming and going. Yes, it does. It looks like we had quite a few late attendees show up. Welcome aboard. All right. So actually moving on to creating a debt pay down strategy. I imagine that if you have, some sort of debt that you're currently living with, this is going to be sort of the big focal point of what brings you to the webinar. And it's one of my favorite things to talk about. So the first step to begin paying off that debt is getting to know everything you can about it. I said it a couple of slides ago. If you currently have debt or multiple lines of credit, you need to get as much information as you can on all of that. So get to know how much you owe, what the interest rate is on each line, what the time frame is for paying them off. Once you have this information, you're able to create a debt paydown strategy. The two commonly used strategies, both with sort of cute names, are the first one being what's called a debt snowball strategy. The focus is on paying off smaller lines of credit first and working your way up. The benefits from it are that you will quickly simplify your financial situation by tackling the smaller lines of credit first. You're going to simplify that situation by decreasing the total number of lines of credit you have to keep track of. So if you've got, for example, 5 credit cards, by slowly working on the smaller ones first, you're going to decrease that down to where you only have 3 lines of debt later down the line. And that's going to be faster. Beyond that, a lot of people also enjoy sort of the motivation that comes from completely paying off a line of debt. The opposite end of this, and this is the one that I typically recommend to clients and I talk a lot more about, is a debt avalanche strategy. It focuses on paying off the higher interest rate debt first and then working your way down from there. So what this means is that you put as much money as you can towards the highest interest rate debt you have, and you put the minimum payments on the rest of your debt. Once you pay off one line of debt, you move on, putting most of your money towards the next highest interest rate line of debt. And the reason I typically end up recommending the debt avalanche strategy is because as long as you're able to sort of keep track of multiple lines of debt, as long as the organizational process and the discipline process isn't too tough on you, debt avalanche will oftentimes lead to you having more money down the line. Long-term, tackling the loans that have a higher interest rate will lead to you having more money available down the line versus something like a debt snowball, which, like I said, ultimately the most important part of whatever debt paydown strategy you go with is that you're able to stick with it. It's not just about, sort of choosing the one that's going to lead you having the most money down the line. It's about selecting the right tool for your unique situation and the one that you're able to really commit to. So creating the plan. It's, again, all about setting clear goals, building good habits. Good habits is something that we're going to come back to a lot in this. As I've said a few times already, gather all the information on the lines of debt you have, decide if you're going to focus on a snowball or avalanche strategy. If you're going with a snowball strategy, list your lines of debt by how much you owe from least to greatest. This is going to be the order in which you pay them off. If you're going with an avalanche strategy, list your lines of debt in order of interest rate from highest to lowest. You're going to prioritize paying off that highest interest rate lines of debt and working your way down. Once you've settled on a strategy and organized your lines of debt, from here, you're actually going to want to figure out how much money you can afford to put toward your debt each week or each month. This goes very heavily back towards our last webinar, which was focused on budgeting. But if you have, for example, you're aiming for a debt avalanche strategy. You set aside $500 per month to paying off debt. You will want to put as much of that $500 as you can toward the highest interest rate line of debt you have and still make the minimum payments on the rest of your debt. If you're planning on a debt snowball strategy, you want to put as much of that $500 towards the smallest line of debt you have and pay off the minimum on the rest. Beyond just making these plans, you want paying off debt to really be a priority. I've had a lot of people come to me, like I said, especially after the last webinar that was on budgeting, a lot of people asking about debt and things like that. If this is something you're serious about, it should be one of your financial goals. It should be, paying off debt should be one of the first places your head goes when you get bonuses, when you get raises, extra money, tax refunds. This is the part that usually takes discipline. If there's anything that people struggle with when it comes to, handling debt or even budgeting or any part of their, financial life, it's really typically the organization and then the discipline. Basically setting up the plan and the follow through. Those are usually the hardest parts that people struggle. And like I said, the big part of it is that, we say it's a priority, but then a lot of people end up, living with a large amount of debt. I've had clients that they wanted to use their tax refund for a vacation every year, which is completely fine. But you have to understand that if you put that tax refund or maybe that yearly bonus towards paying off your debt, the amount of money that would free up in your budget, you'd be able to then use that money to easily afford vacation down the line. And that's really what we're trying to go for, is the sort of investment in ourselves that we're going to give up some short-term satisfaction for much more long-term satisfaction by taking care of this debt. And I can promise you, living debt-free will greatly improve your financial health. And it is very likely to improve your life over the long run. Now, we've discussed a plan for tackling debt. I wanted to also feature some things about credit scores in this, since they're pretty closely intertwined. Most people have some understanding of what goes into credit scores, but effectively your credit score is a number that creditors use to determine your trustworthiness. The idea behind it is that your credit score translates into how risky of an investment it is to loan you money. Credit scores usually exist on a spectrum of 300 to 850, or 300 to 850 rather, with loose dividers on what is considered good or bad depending on the lender. But most lenders follow this pattern. So sort of a good rule of thumb is that less than 600 is typically considered poor credit. 600 to 700 is fair credit. 700 to 750 is good credit. And typically 750 plus is excellent credit. Again, though, this does depend on the creditor. Some creditors are more lenient. Some are more strict. It can also depend on what kind of loan you're going for. And sort of getting a little bit more into the weeds with that. No matter what your credit score is, there are going to be ways to improve it. The 5 factors are what determine your credit score, and by improving them, you can improve your score over time. The biggest factor is going to be payment history. This encompasses things like, have you missed payments? When you make payments, are they on time? The second biggest factor is credit utilization. This is usually, I would say, the most complicated of them. Most people understand how payment history works. It's pretty clear. Credit utilization is how much of your available credit are you using. If you have a credit card with a maximum balance of $5,000, are you keeping that credit card maxed out, or are you using little or none of that available line of credit? Followed by these two is credit card history age. Basically, how long have you had access to a line of credit? And fourthly is types of lines of credit. Do you have, just a credit card? Do you have a mortgage and a car payment as well? And then lastly is credit inquiries. Basically, if a company has looked into your credit score, this sends the signal that you might be looking to take on more debt, which will temporarily lower your credit score, at least until it falls off. Like I said, usually it's about 2 years, and credit inquiries will usually fall off. Now, actually calculating these things can be a little complicated. Like I said, those are the 5 factors that we're going to look at. We're going to, sort of talk more about on how to increase your credit score. So there are definitely good starting points, but I wanted you guys to be aware that there are different credit models. So, and different companies or different lenders might use different credit models, which will lead to you possibly having different credit scores. So also, there are different methodologies. What this means is that dependent on what you are looking to open a line of credit from may determine the best route to improve your credit score. For example, and this is just purely hypothetical, you may be going for some type of loan where they value, payment history and age of credit more than they value credit utilization. So there can be some differences. It's again complicated. There's some flexibility based on how the lender prioritizes those things. But for the most part, those 5 factors in that order are sort of the best way to do it. So, focus on payment history, credit utilization, account length, types of debt, and then recent inquiries. Those are the 5 factors, typically in that order, for you to focus on if you're looking to raise your credit score. So, as I'm sure you figured out, building good credit isn't just a one-time effort. It's an ongoing process. It's ensuring that you're doing right on those 5 factors. It's doing right on them over a long period of time. So I wanted to lay out some pretty clear ways of improving at each factor. Starting again with payment history, the most important factor. Basically ensuring that you're paying at least the minimum on your lines of debt on time every single time. For credit utilization, you want to get sort of a soft goal. You want to use no more than 30% of your available credit. That's kind of a soft goal. Less than 30% is good. Less than 10% is great. So those are sort of the 2 numbers you want to keep in mind when it comes to credit utilization. And the way to accomplish that is that you have to either pay off debt until you're below 30%, and I want to be very, very clear about this one, because you need to be responsible if you go this route. Alternatively, you can also improve your credit utilization rate by increasing the amount of credit you have available. So what I mean by that is that if you want to get to where you're only utilizing 30% of your available credit, let's say you have, $10,000 available to you and you have used $4,000. That would mean that your current credit utilization was 40%. So that would again be over that 30%. That would be seen as probably, less preferred by most lenders. So your options would be to either, pay off, over $1,000. That would put you under that 30% utilization rate. Or if you got access to another, $5,000 in credit to where you now had, available credit options of up to $15,000, that $4,000 would now be less than that 30% credit utilization. So if you're trying to improve your credit utilization, you either have to pay down to that point or increase the maximum amount of debt you have access to. Like I said, though, be very careful with this strategy. The last thing you want to do is give yourself access to more debt, and you end up actually using it and getting yourself into a worse situation. So I'm usually pretty hesitant that if someone has some sort of credit issue, recommending that they get access to more credit, but it is an option if you're trying to improve your credit utilization. So the third factor is length of credit history. It typically kind of takes care of itself. I mean, really all you have to do is just keep lines of credit open. I recommend looking at how much you are paying for lines of credit. Some credit cards have yearly fees and some are free. If you're looking to open a line of credit just to improve the length of credit history factor, try to get a card that doesn't have any yearly fees. Try to get one that is really, truly free, and you just sort of keep that account open. The fourth factor is focusing on having multiple types of credit lines. So basically, like I said, having a credit card, car mortgage, a car payment, mortgage, having multiple differing types of lines of credit is what improves this factor. And that one can be a little bit more complicated, and also is kind of rough when it comes to the fifth factor, which is recent inquiries. It's counterintuitive because a lot of these can benefit from having access to more credit, like I said, credit utilization, having multiple differing lines of credit. They all benefit from you sort of applying for more lines of credit. But every time you apply for a line of credit, you're going to have a credit inquiry, and that's going to decrease your credit score, at least temporarily. So you should avoid regularly and frequently applying for lines of credit, as like I said, that will, at least temporarily, lower your credit score. Most credit inquiries will fall off after about 2 years, but it's something where you don't want to be applying for credit roughly every 2 years, and then you constantly have this inquiry on your credit history. That will, again, keep your credit score lower than it should be. So we've talked about sort of a debt paydown strategy. We've talked about your credit score. I want to have a couple of slides in here that really just focused on actionable steps for people who may be currently living with a good amount of debt, or an amount of debt that is causing them stress or issues on their income. So starting with some pretty, I would say, low-hanging fruit credit building tools. Sort of the things that I recommend is, if you're in a very difficult situation when it comes to credit, things like getting a secured credit card. What that means is that there is a pool of cash as collateral behind that credit card. So if you are in a tough situation or you have a low credit score, it is easier to qualify, and they're typically more lenient with approval when it comes to a secured credit card. So it's an option if you're really having trouble trying to build your credit because no one will loan to you or no one will open a line of credit for you. I would say that definitely looking into secured credit cards. If you have a bad credit history or low credit score, you can also have someone make you an authorized user on their credit card. It's again, they take on some risk. It can be a little complicated, but ultimately, if they make you an authorized user on their card, it can improve your credit based on them and that line of credit. So it is another alternative if you are currently in a debt situation where you're really having trouble qualifying for getting lines of credit to start trying to build yourself out of it. So debt consolidation is another big option. Is that if you've got many lines of credit, like I said, it's complicated oftentimes, especially if they're credit cards or consumer debt, they're usually pretty high interest rate. Debt consolidation is a way to try to make that debt much more manageable. It'll hopefully help you get on track with building a credit score or repairing a damaged one. Basically, debt consolidation is the process of combining multiple lines of debt into a singular, more manageable loan. The key incentive often revolves around securing a lower interest rate. If you can make it happen, and that's usually what is the biggest simplifying factor in this whole debt consolidation process. But like a lot of these options, it can be a little complicated. So what you really want to consider is that if you go with debt consolidation, is it going to make your debt more manageable? Is it going to reduce the overall interest rate that you're paying on that debt? Is it going to help you expedite your debt payoff schedule? So those are really the questions you want to answer before you pull the trigger on something like this. But again, be warned, there are cons to debt consolidation. You have to understand the sort of fine print of what you're getting into. Also, there may be upfront costs, so you need to weigh those as well. And then missing payments can set you back even further than it would have otherwise before loan consolidation. So keep in mind that if you go a debt consolidation route, again, this sort of goes back to your financial patterns. Make sure that you're going to be able to really pay off this debt consolidation on time and without missing payments, or you can put yourself into a worse position than you were before. Finally, the nuclear option, bankruptcy. It's pretty complicated. It's very much legal as much as it is financial, but it's for people who are experiencing overwhelming financial strain from things like debt. Ideally, it's going to be a pretty structured solution, and the goal of it is a little ironic, but the goal of it is to offer a fresh start in dire financial situations. So that, it can help with debt for sure. But in terms of the fresh start, it's going to hang around on your credit history for quite some time. And because of that, you're going to have trouble getting lines of credit in the future. The two primary types of bankruptcy available for individuals is going to be a Chapter 7, which is often referred to as liquidation. It involves the sale of non-exempt assets to repay creditors. It also will allow you to discharge certain debts. This provides an opportunity for sort of as close to a clean slate as you can get in terms of shaking off that debt. The other option is Chapter 13. It's known as reorganization. It sets up a plan to repay debts over a specific time frame, typically 3 to 5 years. So it gives you the chance to repay debts without liquidating all of your assets. It is crucial to note that the decision to file for bankruptcy brings a lot of consequences. Like I was saying, it's going to impact your credit score. It's going to remain on credit reports for typically at least 10 years. So while bankruptcy does provide relief from overwhelming debt, it does have some pretty hefty downsides. It also involves some eligibility criteria. There are financial assessments, qualifications. There are things that influence the type of bankruptcy you can file for. But if you're in a difficult situation and considering something like bankruptcy, which if you are truly in a very difficult financial situation when it comes to debt, There is, nothing wrong with at least considering or looking into bankruptcy. It can be scary, absolutely. And I know a lot of people are very scared of bankruptcy, but I want you to be aware that it is an option, and that if you are considering it, look up Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 bankruptcy. Get to know what your options are, understand the consequences, and I would definitely recommend speaking with an advisor. Like I said, this is something that's going to be on your credit report for 10 years. So it's going to have some impacts on your life. I would definitely recommend, if you're considering it, talk to an advisor. This is something that you want to be absolutely sure on before you do it. But it is an option if you're absolutely just overwhelmed with the amount of debt you've taken on. Now, ultimately, though, debt consolidation, becoming an authorized user in someone else's card, or filing for bankruptcy, all of these things will only get you so far. A lot of your credit score, improving it or damaging it, again, comes back to your spending habits. As I keep saying, building good or repairing bad credit is not a quick process. It's not fun, and it's much faster to hurt your credit than it is to help it grow. Like I just said, talking about bankruptcy, debt consolidation, getting a secure credit card, the last thing we want is for you to, file for bankruptcy and then get yourself right back into the same spot as you were before. And that's sort of, my worst nightmare as a financial planner for one of my clients is that, we go through all this to fix it. And then in the end, because a lot of this comes from foundational spending habits, if those aren't fixed alongside it, you're going to get right back into the same bad situation. So my recommendation is to build good habits and discipline first and foremost. Make sure that, you have sort of all of your ducks in the row in terms of discipline and organization before you really start looking at all these other options you have. Create a budget, stick with it, make sure it has money set aside for debts, set up payment reminders, automate bill payments, keep your credit card balances low. Again, we want to keep our credit utilization down to below 30%. 10% is even better. And while emergencies do happen, you really should not be using your credit card for anything else. Day-to-day purchases have very little reason to go on your credit card. Some people fixate on the marketed and advertised benefits of using your credit cards. Ultimately, it is often worse down the line. I'll put it this way. Credit card companies wouldn't advertise benefits to you unless it made them more money than they spend in the long run. They want you to use your credit card for day-to-day purchases. That alone should be enough to make you think, I probably shouldn't be using my credit card for day-to-day purchases. So it's really should be used for emergencies, for, wise investments. That's really what your lines of credit should be focused on. So to sort of put it succinctly, the 3 biggest credit mistakes I see, and they are a little obvious, but this is usually whenever people have a lot of debt issues. The most common issues I see is maxing out your credit cards, missing payments, and applying for multiple credit accounts within a very short time frame. Like I said, they're pretty obvious, but the reason why I really want to talk about them is because most people don't understand how intertwined pretty much all of your credit are. Those 5 factors that I talked to you about, these 3 sort of pitfalls, they are very much interconnected. So whenever once you sort of max out your credit card, you've got no debt to lean on in an emergency. So if an emergency happens, you are going to start missing payments. You're going to have to start applying for other lines of credit to sort of make those emergencies get fixed. So right there, in just sort of one very simple and pretty likely situation, you check the boxes on hitting all 3 of those pitfalls I just talked about. So again, these issues are really intertwined, are really interconnected. Whenever you start maxing out credit cards, you again start missing payments, you start applying for more credit cards. It's a domino effect, basically all coming together to ruin your credit score. So it's a big part of the reason why I recommend most people maintain a line of credit only to really grow their score, not to actually use it most of the time. If you're having any other issues financially, like living paycheck to paycheck, not having an emergency fund, if you have any issues financially beyond, credit or debt, you are much more likely to get into debt problems. And that's really just the fact of it. And that's also the big things that we sort of focus on the next few slides after this one. As you're going through this process, you're, like I said, hopefully have taken some notes on how you're going to, improve your credit or fix your credit or, made a debt pay down strategy. Hopefully you've at least gotten together some information and paperwork on, the information regarding your debt. As you're going through this process, monitor it. I'm sure a lot of you, take a look at your credit card statements every once in a while, but I mean, really, truly monitoring your credit situation. It means going beyond just that. I started this presentation, if you remember, it was, I think, the first or second slide, talking about how you should know everything there is to know about your credit, specifically how much you owe, what the credit rate is, what the timeline is for paying it off. If you aren't able to say those things sort of offhand, right off the top of your head, you aren't diligently monitoring your credit reports. This needs to become routine. It should be something you are always on top of. I mean, if you've taken out a line of credit and you now owe a debt, that's something you should know everything there is to know about. So again, first step, and I wanted to recap it here since we were kind of moving on from talking about credit scores and debt. Monitor it, get to know it, know your debt. That's going to be the first step to sort of really making a plan to tackle it. Now, I felt like it was impossible to really discuss debt without including information on an emergency fund. No one plans on getting into a tough situation with debt. For many, it comes from having an emergency or something unexpected comes up that forces us to take on debt to cover it. Whether that's medical, that's something where you had to use your credit card for maybe a car payment, maybe some sort of house repair was necessary. The vast majority of people don't have an emergency fund. And it's going to be a huge source of stress. So while we're discussing improving our financial health and spending habits, we have to talk about planning for an emergency fund. Whether we like it or not, emergencies are almost an inevitability. The last thing we want is for us to, again, start building up our credit, start, making positive steps towards improving our habits, start paying down off the debt that we may already have, only for then an emergency to come up and we end up depending on our credit card once again. We want to start out really focusing on, sort of two-pronged, handling the debt that we may already have and focusing on building an emergency fund so we don't have to take on more debt. The typical rule of thumb for an emergency fund is aiming for about 3 to 6 months of living expenses. I'm going to put this money in a safe and liquid place, somewhere that you can draw on it quickly if need be. And again, I know that 3 to 6 months can seem daunting. Most Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So trying to save up 3 to 6 months can be a big task, but getting away from living paycheck to paycheck is really what your financial health, getting it under control, really means. Even if you just save $5 a day, in a couple of months, you'll have enough to cover a lot of small emergencies. Talked about car repairs. In just, again, $5 a day in a couple of months, you'll be able to cover a lot of lower end car payment issues. Like, needing new tires, things like that. Those are common emergencies that people will put on their credit cards. So while in the long term, living without an emergency fund is going to be risky, I do want to make it clear that I know, like I said, a lot of people live paycheck to paycheck. It is absolutely okay to slowly begin building one up. Start now, aim to put something like even, like I said, $5 a day, $35 a week into an emergency fund. Over time, this will build up, and when a car problem or medical issue arises, this will go a long way towards helping ensure that we don't need to take on more debt to get by. Sort of also a little bonus is that I recommend putting this money somewhere that it will grow, so inflation doesn't erode it so bad. The last thing you want is to put your emergency fund underneath your bed, and then whenever you finally do have an emergency, maybe a couple of years down the line, inflation's made that money worth not nearly as much as it would have been otherwise. So things like high yield savings accounts, money market funds, other very liquid investment vehicles are very good options for your emergency fund. They'll provide access to your money quickly enough that you can use it when you need it, but will still grow enough to compete with or hopefully beat out inflation. So When in doubt, like I said, especially about something like bankruptcy, even debt consolidation, sort of when in doubt, work with a financial professional. If you select the correct one, the way they get paid will be entirely transparent. The benefits they provide should more than make up for their cost. No matter at what point in your life you're at now, your finances are going to be one of the most impactful forces in your life. I recommend everyone have a professional that you can depend on, create a personalized plan for you. Finance and wealth management, for me personally, like I said, it's basically takes up my entire life. I am always researching these things, writing articles, making webinars on them. So if you ever want some recommendations or some help, I am happy to give some. So please, if you want extra support, I'd be happy to set up some time to discuss your situation. All right. Now, I know I've hit you guys with a lot. Hopefully not too much. Hopefully it was all valuable. Like I said, I want it to be as actionable as it is informative. So I hope that you guys have all taken something away from it. Before we move on to the Q&A, I wanted to just sort of wrap up listing off the things that we went through. What I recommend each of you do to sort of improve your debt situation or improve your credit score. The first one being, if you don't have a budget, start by building one. This is really going to be the foundation of any sort of financial improvement in your life. Is if you're living without a budget, that's the first place to look. I would start out building a budget. For this webinar specifically, make sure to include room for paying off debt in that budget. Next, create a plan to tackle the debt that you currently have. We specifically talked about, a snowball strategy versus an avalanche strategy for eliminating debt. Look at ways of repairing and growing your credit score. Things like becoming an authorized user on someone else's card or debt consolidation. Focusing on the 5 factors that go into your credit score. Build up good financial habits. Don't rely on your credit card all the time. Save up money for an emergency fund. And like I said, when in doubt, there's nothing wrong with working with a professional. So I also wanted to sort of leave it off with a very positive note. I understand how hopeless debt can feel and how slow building a credit score can be. It's not fun. I grew up in a very impoverished part of Appalachia. So I saw a lot of people living on debt, in what they seemed like a hopeless financial situation. And I still have, clients come to me and they're very tight and they have issues with these things. And it's not fun and it can be stressful, but I really want to reiterate that it's not hopeless. You have options. I've seen some debt situations that were probably far worse than anyone on this call, and those people were able to get out from under it. And I'm confident that you could too. Create a plan, do the right things, build the right habits, and your situation will improve. And you're because of that, in the long run, your life and the life of your family will improve along with it. All right, it's time for my favorite part, the Q&A session. So at the bottom of your screen, there should be a place to submit questions. It may also be in like an arrow in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So while you type those out, I'd like to thank you guys for coming again. I have loved doing these webinars. I really appreciate the support. We get way more registrants than I ever would have expected. I think that for this one, it was like 85 or something. So still, I thank you guys so much for being interested in this stuff, for enabling me to sort of make this type of content. I'm Chad Lively. I'm the lead financial planner of Lively Financial. I'm happy to help any one of you on this call. So feel free, reach out, give me a phone call, shoot me an email. You can also go to our website, livelyfinancial.net. You can book a time with me from there. We also have a newsletter. We have a YouTube channel where these webinars get saved to. I'll also probably post a link to that onto my LinkedIn. I know that's how most people got here. And I also publish a lot of articles on our website. So again, take a look at our stuff. Reach out to me if you have any questions, or honestly, reach out to me if you just have feedback. I'd love to hear if you think that there's a format that could improve these webinars, or if you didn't see something that you wanted to see. So definitely reach out. Let me see. I think that I saw some questions come in. Let me see if I'm pulling them up. Okay. All right. The first question. what is the difference between good and bad debt again? So, good debt typically refers to borrowing for investments that can increase in value or generate income. Again, as things like a mortgage, things like student loans. A mortgage is an investment in a property. You're taking on debt to invest in real estate. Student loans is you're taking on debt to invest in hopefully having a higher salary in the future because of that. Bad debt is the opposite of that. It's high interest consumer debt. It's used to purchase depreciating assets. Things like credit cards are sort of the go-to example for bad debt. It's typically for non-essential items. But again, I want to be clear about it that I hesitate to ever say good debt. I prefer to call it better debt because whether it's a mortgage or student loans, it can still put pressure and stress on you. But to put it succinctly, if the debt is an investment, then it leans towards being better debt. If it's anything else, it's probably considered bad debt. All right. Is it better to pay off the debt with the highest interest rate or the smallest balance first? So you're really pressing me to decide if a debt avalanche or debt snowball strategy is better. So those are the two strategies we talked about. Either, like I said, paying off higher interest rates first. That's going to be a debt avalanche. Paying off the smallest balances first. That's going to be a debt snowball. Again, I want to say that they both have merit. The debt avalanche saves you more on interest. Because of that, that's usually the one I default to recommending. But it is a little bit tougher on, sort of the organizational aspect. You're oftentimes not going to cut down on those lines of credit as quickly. So you're not going to simplify your financial situation as fast. But a debt avalanche, because you're decreasing the interest rates, will usually lead to you having more money in the long run. Debt snowball strategy is still just as valid, though. Again, that psychological boost of sort of paying off lines of debt, people really seem to like that a lot more than you think. And also, by eliminating smaller debts first, you're going to quickly simplify your financial situation. I mean, oftentimes, if you have 5 lines of credit, assuming you haven't just absolutely maxed out all 5 of those credit cards, there's a good chance that you can pretty quickly pay off one of those lines of credit. Now you only have 4 to work with. Or maybe you can quickly pay off 2. Now you only have 3 to work with. And simplifying those things does really help with the budgeting and getting to know your financial situation. So again, though, I lean towards recommending the debt avalanche approach simply because I make really, long-term financial plans with my clients. And a debt avalanche approach, assuming they can stick with it, and it's one of the things I help them is sticking with it, a debt avalanche approach will lead to them having more money down the line. So, but the best strategy is the one that you can stick with. How frequently should I check my credit report? So, I don't know. I've heard people advise that you should review your credit report from each of the 3 major credit bureaus at least once a year. The idea is, ensure accuracy, identity theft detection, give you insight into factors affecting your credit score. But the more you monitor and keep your eye on these things, the faster you can respond to issues, you can detect problems. And again, this is something that we really want to be on top of. So I'd say bare minimum, at least once a year. Staying on top of it more is obviously advisable. Can closing a credit card affect my credit score? This is a really good question because a lot of people, especially we talked about sort of a debt pay down strategy, as you start paying off these lines of credit, people start thinking, I don't owe anything on this credit card. It's just sitting around. I'm not using it. Should I turn it off? And closing a credit card can impact your credit score sometimes negatively. The 2 big things is that it's going to reduce your available credit, which again can increase your credit utilization ratio. And it also can decrease your age of credit. So those are 2 factors that can actually be negatively impacted by closing a credit card. Ultimately, if you have, discipline issues or you have problems resisting the urge, closing a line of credit is definitely not a bad idea. But as long as you have self-control, you can resist using it, especially if the card has no annual fee. Keeping it open may be beneficial to your credit. It might help lower that credit utilization. It'll help you get a longer credit card history. So So I would say if you can resist the call, keep it open as long as it's not, extremely expensive. But if you have trouble with the sort of self-control aspect, then there's nothing wrong with just shutting yourself off from lines of credit. So what is, again, the ideal credit utilization ratio? So I recommend a good goal is keeping your credit utilization below 30%. That's sort of a soft goal. For a better credit score, aim for utilization rate of 10% or lower. So if you have access to $10,000, try to keep your credit utilization below $1,000. That'd be 10%. Or, below $3,000 for that 30% goal. So the two numbers you really want to keep in mind is 30% is good, 10% is great. How long does negative information stay on a credit report? So most negative information, things like missed payments, collection accounts, they can stay on your credit report for 7 years. That's usually the number I hear from most of them. Bankruptcies will remain for usually up to 10 years. And it seems long, and it is pretty long, but over the course of your lifetime, you absolutely can recover from these things. I mean, I'll put it this way. If you're 35 now, you decide to file for bankruptcy, that's going to fall off your credit score by the time you're 45. I mean, that's a long time, but you, at the age of 45, have a lot of life left to live. And having the opportunity to, sort of live that without having to deal with some of the debts or the mistakes you made in the past, that can really improve your life. Now, can negotiating with creditors affect my credit score? So, negotiating with creditors for a payment plan or for a debt settlement might initially impact your credit score. However, ideally it helps you resolve the debt, and by making timely payments, you'll rebuild that over time. So yes, negotiating with creditors can affect your credit score. Typically, initially, it'll impact it. But over the long run, if you come to an amicable agreement, it will improve it. Are there credit repair services worth considering? So while some credit repair services might offer legitimate assistance in correcting errors on your credit report, be very cautious of those companies that are promising you a quick fix. I've seen ads and heard telemarketers saying that they can repair your credit instantaneously. Be very careful dealing with those companies. Yeah, I'll put it this way: for most issues that you have in terms of your credit, that's like really valid issues, you yourself can typically dispute errors on your credit report completely for free if you feel like there's an issue. And so, these companies at best are going to help you with a service you can probably do yourself, and at worst are not trustworthy companies. Should I prioritize paying off debt or saving for emergencies? So like I said, I know it is tough, but we want to balance both objectives. It's really a two-pronged approach. While paying off, high interest rate debt is absolutely vital, having an emergency fund is going to safeguard you from taking on additional debt during unforeseen circumstances. If you pay off debt but don't have an emergency fund, the next time an emergency does occur, you're probably going to have to go right back into debt to solve it. So on the other hand, if you let your debt grow while you focus solely on building an emergency fund, this can, again, decrease the amount of money that you have to put down towards your emergency fund. And it also can put you into a pretty deep debt hole by the time you finally finish building out that emergency fund. So you want to build your budget and financial plan to accomplish both paying down debt and building an emergency fund. It is more complicated, but it's really the two-pronged approach that I would recommend. How does debt consolidation affect credit scores? So debt consolidation can initially result in a slight dip in your credit score due to the credit inquiry that you're probably going to have to take on to, get the debt consolidation. Also, you're closing existing accounts, which can impact things like account age. Sometimes it can also impact your credit utilization. But over time, as the debt is paid down, it can have positive impacts on your credit. So debt consolidation is a long-term decision. It's important to understand what you're getting into when you decide on it. Can you explain debt to income ratio? Yes. So had this on, I want to say maybe the first or the third slide where I threw up some information about debt to income. There's something I wanted you guys to know about. I don't think I really ended up talking about it, so I like that you asked. Debt to income ratio measures the proportion of your monthly income that goes towards paying debt. Lenders use this to assess your ability to manage monthly payments, meaning that it impacts your eligibility for loans and the terms you receive. Beyond that, and I almost consider this more important, debt to income is something you should understand because it plays a big part into your budgeting. Seeing how much money you can set aside to pay for your debts, that's going to be a big factor that goes into your budgeting. All right, I don't see too many questions, and it is about 3 minutes till. So I will just quickly repeat. Again, I'm Chad Lively. I'm the lead financial planner of Lively Financial. If any of you have any questions that we didn't get to today, or you would like to set up a time to meet with me, I'm happy to talk to any of you guys. So give me a call, shoot me an email, book a time on the website, livelyfinancial.net, and I would love to meet with you guys. So again, thank you all for coming. I keep gushing about it, but I am thrilled at the support that these webinars have gotten. So again, thank you guys. I will give you all back about 3 minutes of your time to go to lunch, and I hope you guys have a great day.